Somewhere along Iran's southern coastline, a radar tower that had tracked ships through the Strait of Hormuz for years went dark in a single night. U.S. Central Command later confirmed it. The Shahid Kalantari port surveillance tower at Chah Bahar, one of the eyes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had used for decades to watch commercial traffic in the Gulf of Oman, was gone. That single strike is a small piece of a much larger campaign, and it's the campaign, not one made-for-television moment, that this story is actually about. To understand why an American stealth fighter would be anywhere near Iran's coast in the first place, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That's the date President Donald Trump announced what the Pentagon would call major combat operations against Iran, launched jointly with Israel. The Department of War's own after-action fact sheet, released under the title Operation Epic Fury, laid out the scale bluntly. Within the first 13 days, American and Allied forces had struck roughly 6,000 targets and damaged or destroyed more than 90 Iranian vessels. The list of aircraft involved reads like a fifth-generation air power showcase. B-1 bombers, B-2 stealth bombers, B-52s, F-22 Raptors, and, importantly for this story, F-35's stealth fighters, all flying alongside Patriot and THAAD missile defense batteries meant to shield American bases in the region. The F-35 wasn't a side character in that opening phase. Its entire design philosophy, low observability, integrated sensor fusion, the ability to slip past radar coverage that would light up a fourth-generation jet like a flare, made it one of the primary tools for penetrating Iranian airspace to gather targeting data or deliver precision munitions deep inside contested territory. That's a meaningfully different mission profile than a standoff strike launched from outside enemy radar range. It means these aircraft were operating exactly where Iran's coastal defense network was built to detect them. And that network is the second half of this story. Iran's Gulf coast, particularly the stretch running past Bandar Abbas and down to Chah Bahar on the Gulf of Oman, is lined with a decades-old system of surveillance towers, mobile radar units, and coastal missile batteries. According to U.S. Central Command, that system exists for one core purpose from Tehran's side: tracking and, when ordered, targeting commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply normally passes. From Washington's side, that same network became priority target number one the moment Iran began using it to coordinate attacks on merchant shipping. By mid-July, CENTCOM's public statements had settled into an almost nightly rhythm. On July 17th, the command announced it had completed its sixth consecutive night of major strikes, and specifically credited the destruction of that Chah Bahar surveillance tower to the campaign, describing it in a public statement as part of a maritime surveillance network the IRGC had used for years to track vessels along Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline. 2 days earlier, CENTCOM said its forces, fighter jets, aerial drones, and warships together, had hit dozens of targets, including coastal surveillance and air defense sites, and had specifically gone after the road and rail bridges leading into Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's most important naval choke points on the strait. The campaign didn't slow down from there. By July 19th, CENTCOM announced its 9th consecutive night of strikes, again listing coastal surveillance nodes and integrated air defense sites among the targets, this time framing the goal explicitly as restoring the security of commercial shipping through the strait. 3 days later, on July 22nd, the 12th consecutive night wrapped up with the same target categories, repeated almost verbatim in the command statement: maritime capabilities, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, air defense assets. By that point, according to reporting compiled by Army Recognition, the broader air and maritime campaign had engaged more than 140 separate Iranian military targets, and an earlier U.S. naval blockade, running from April 13th to June 18th, had already redirected 6 commercial vessels away from Iranian ports and disabled one outright. It's worth pausing on that timeline because it tells you something the title of this story might not. This was never a single dramatic raid. It was attrition. Night after night, American aircraft, F-35's among them, alongside fourth-generation fighters, drones, and naval assets, worked through a target list built around one strategic goal: strip Iran of its ability to see and strike ships in the strait. Each individual strike on a radar site or a surveillance tower is, by itself, a relatively minor tactical event. Strung together across weeks, it adds up to the systematic dismantling of a coastal defense architecture Iran had spent years building. That systematic pressure did not go unanswered. Iran's retaliatory options were more limited than its rhetoric, but they were real. Iranian ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones were launched at U.S. positions across Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Bahrain throughout the campaign. ABC News, citing CENTCOM, reported that by July 19th, those counterstrikes had killed 17 American service members since the war began, a toll that includes losses from causes as mundane as a controlled detonation of unexploded drone ordnance in northern Iraq, and as chaotic as friendly fire. The friendly fire incident is worth explaining because it shows how confused this war has been, even for the side that supposedly controls the skies. In early March, 3 U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles were shot down, not by Iran, but by a Kuwaiti fighter jet in what multiple outlets, including Air and Space Forces magazine, described as a friendly fire incident. The American air crews survived. Around the same time, a U.S. Air Force KC-135 refueling tanker crashed in western Iraq, killing all 6 crew members aboard. Again, not attributed to Iranian action. And separately, in early April, a U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over Iran's Kogaluya and Boyar Ahmed province, triggering a 2-day combat search and rescue operation involving special operations forces from multiple branches, which ultimately recovered both crew members alive. Iran claimed to have killed several IRGC facing American assets during that rescue. The U.S. described some of its own losses during the operation as self-destroyed equipment rather than combat losses. The point isn't to relitigate every incident. It's to establish that this conflict has been messy, contested, and full of claims that don't survive contact with official confirmation. Which brings us to the F-35 specifically, and to the incident that most directly connects this aircraft to Iran's coastal defenses. On March 19, 2026, Iran's IRGC claimed it had struck a U.S. F-35 with a surface-to-air missile during a combat mission over Iranian territory, calling it a severe hit. CENTCOM's response, delivered through spokesperson Captain Tim Hawkins, confirmed part of the story without confirming all of it. The command acknowledged that a U.S. F-35 had made an emergency landing at a regional American airbase after flying a combat mission over Iran, that the aircraft landed safely, and that the pilot was in stable condition. Hawkins added that the incident was under investigation and declined to confirm whether Iranian fire was actually responsible. CNN, citing 2 sources familiar with the matter, reported that the aircraft had indeed been hit during the mission, and if true, it would have marked the first time in the war that Iranian air defenses successfully engaged a U.S. combat aircraft. Air and Space Forces magazine later reported that the pilot suffered shrapnel wounds based on people familiar with the matter, though the U.S. military did not comment publicly on the extent of the damage to the jet itself. Analysts treated the episode as more than a single news cycle. Defense Security Asia, an outlet that covers regional military affairs, framed it as a strategic signal rather than just a tactical footnote. The argument being that an aircraft specifically designed to penetrate advanced air defense networks being engaged at all indicated Iran's coastal and inland defense coordination was still functioning despite weeks of sustained bombardment. Whether the jet was detected during its approach into Iranian airspace or during its exit afterward remains, according to that same analysis, an open question with real implications for how deep penetration missions get planned going forward. Iran's Tasnim news agency also circulated video purporting to show the engagement, showing what appeared to be flares being deployed by the targeted aircraft. But Air and Space Forces magazine was explicit that it could not verify the video's authenticity, and neither can this script. That March incident set the pattern for almost everything that's happened between the IRGC and CENTCOM since. A claim from Tehran, a partial or full denial from Washington, and very little that gets fully resolved in public. That pattern repeated itself again in late July in an episode directly tied to Iran's coast. According to Iranian media reports cited by Middle East Monitor, the IRGC claimed on July 30th that it had targeted Al-Azraq Air Base in Jordan's eastern desert with ballistic missiles, striking a deployment ramp and maintenance hangar and, in its own account, destroying 3 F-35 fighter jets outright, while heavily damaging 3 others, with officers and maintenance personnel among the casualties. The IRGC described the strike as a direct response to a U.S. attack on 2 residential homes on Iran's Qeshm island, an island that sits directly in the Strait of Hormuz and has been a recurring flashpoint throughout this coastal campaign. CENTCOM's answer came fast and blunt. In a statement reported by outlets including Signals of Santa Clarita, KVIA, and the Russian-language edition of Pravda USA covering U.S. affairs, the command said flatly that no U.S. aircraft, including F-35 fighter jets, had been destroyed or damaged in the attack, and added that every incoming Iranian missile and drone had either been intercepted or failed to reach its target. Iranwire's reporting on the same CENTCOM statement noted that this was actually the 3rd time in a short span that the command had specifically dismissed IRGC claims as false, including a separate Iranian claim that an oil tanker named Nora had broken through the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, which CENTCOM also denied. So which version is true? As of this recording, there is no independent, named, nonpartisan confirmation. No satellite imagery analysis from a recognized open-source outlet, no on-record U.S. military acknowledgement of losses. That settles the Al-Azraq claim one way or the other. That's not a small caveat. It's the difference between reporting a confirmed event and repeating a claim, and this script is not going to blur that line for the sake of a punchier ending. What is well documented and considerably harder to dismiss is what CENTCOM's statement did not directly address: the strike on Qeshm Island that the IRGC says triggered its retaliation claim in the first place. According to Iran's press TV, citing Ahmad Nafesi, the deputy governor of Hormozgan province, an overnight U.S. strike hit a residential building in the Cha Tangu neighborhood of Qeshm City on July 30th. Nafisi said a father, mother, and their 2-year-old child were killed, and that 2 other children from the family, reported by Tasnim news agency to be 7 and 9 years old, were pulled from the rubble and hospitalized. Tasnim identified the father as a taxi driver and described the area as a working-class residential neighborhood. Al Jazeera's own reporting corroborated the basic sequence of events, that explosions were heard on Qeshm Island around the time in question, and that Tasnim reported a missile had struck a residential area, while noting that this came during a broader wave of U.S. strikes that CENTCOM said were launched in response to an attempted Iranian ballistic missile attack on American forces the day before. It's important to be precise about sourcing here. The specific casualty figures, the ages of the children, the identity of the family, the confirmation that search and rescue operations concluded with 3 bodies recovered, come from Iranian officials and Iranian state or semi-official media, Press TV, Tasnim, and IRIB. As of this recording, U.S. Central Command has not issued a statement directly confirming or denying the reported death of the 2-year-old, even in a fact-check release that addressed several other Iranian claims from the same period. That's a gap in official confirmation from the American side, not proof that the Iranian account is either accurate or fabricated. Iran's Qeshm prosecutor, Abdulrazak Narimani, went further in public remarks reported by Press TV, describing the strike as a clear violation of international law and announcing a judicial case pursued through both domestic and international channels, a characterization that is itself a claim by an interested party in an active war, and is presented here as exactly that. Qeshm Island's appearance in this story isn't a coincidence, and it isn't the first time the island has come up during this campaign. Back in early March, near the start of Operation Epic Fury, Iran accused the United States of striking a desalination plant on Qeshm Island, an attack Iran said disrupted freshwater supplies to roughly 30 villages. Both the United States and Israel denied carrying out that particular strike. Iran's parliamentary speaker at the time warned it would draw what officials called a proportionate response. Whether or not that specific accusation was accurate, the broader pattern is not in dispute. Qeshm Island, sitting directly astride the Strait of Hormuz, has been targeted, struck, and fought over repeatedly since the war's opening days, precisely because of its position on Iran's coastal defense and surveillance line. The naval side of this campaign deserves its own moment because F-35's weren't operating alone over Iran's coastline. They were part of a much larger joint force built around American sea power. In early March, CENTCOM's commander at the time, Admiral Brad Cooper, told reporters at a briefing in Tampa that U.S. forces had, in his words, hit an Iranian drone carrier ship roughly the size of a World War II aircraft carrier, adding that the vessel was on fire as he spoke. Cooper said the broader mission wasn't limited to destroying what Iran already had in its arsenal. The stated goal, according to his own remarks reported by Fox News, was to systematically dismantle Iran's ability to rebuild its ballistic missile industrial base going forward. Around that same period, CENTCOM said on social media that the USS Gerald R. Ford, described by the command as the world's largest aircraft carrier, was running around-the-clock operations in the region, while the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli arrived separately with roughly 3,500 sailors and Marines aboard. That's the scale of naval and air power arrayed against a coastline that, at the start of the war, was defended mainly by shore-based radar towers, mobile missile batteries, and small fast attack boats. The human cost on the American side extended well beyond the F-35 incidents already discussed. In late March, Fox News reported that a dozen U.S. service members were injured when a ballistic missile struck Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, an attack independently confirmed to Fox by 2 separate official sources as involving both Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. That single strike illustrates something worth remembering about this entire campaign. While F-35 missions over Iran's coast generated some of the most dramatic individual headlines, the broader pattern of casualties on both sides came from missile and drone exchanges across multiple countries: Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia among them, not from any single dueling engagement between a stealth fighter and a coastal radar site. The rhythm of escalation and de-escalation around Qeshm and the broader coastal campaign is also worth noting because it wasn't constant. Al Jazeera's own reporting on the July 30th strikes noted that the heavy wave of attacks that killed the family in Cha Tang came after a 5-night pause in U.S. strikes, triggered specifically by an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. base in Jordan the day before. In the aftermath, Jordan and Kuwait both reported Iranian strikes on their own territory, with Kuwait confirming 1 fatality. Iran's own IRGC said 3 of its personnel were killed in the American response, separate from the Qeshm Island casualties, and Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting from Tehran, Rasul Serdar Abbas, described the strikes as concentrated in Iran's southern provinces along the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, calling the pattern similar to an earlier 13-day campaign the U.S. had carried out against the same coastal belt. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent framed the strategic reasoning in a social media post at the time, writing that the United States would not allow Iran to hold global commerce hostage or use international shipping to help finance the IRGC. There's another figure worth knowing before we go further, because it explains why Iran's coastal defenses became such an early and repeated target. According to a real-time tracker maintained by the defense-focused outlet Military Spend, drawing on agency releases including the International Energy Agency, the IRGC Navy's commander Alireza Tangsiri was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Bandar Abbas on March 26, 2026, alongside several senior naval aides. U.S. and Israeli officials had identified Tangsiri as the architect of Iran's Hormuz blockade strategy, the man most directly responsible for the doctrine Iran's coastal forces were executing. Iran confirmed his death 4 days later on March 30th. His killing didn't end the blockade posture he'd built, but it did mark one of the earliest and clearest signals that Bandar Abbas itself, not just the surveillance towers ringing it, had become a direct target. The economic stakes behind all of this are worth spelling out too, because they explain why a war fought partly over radar towers and surveillance equipment made international headlines for months. The same military spend tracker reported that Brent crude futures peaked near $118 to $120 a barrel in March 2026, a roughly 64% spike from pre-war levels around $72, while physical cargoes reportedly traded as high as $150 a barrel at the peak of the disruption. The International Energy Agency, according to that same reporting, characterized the Hormuz disruption as the largest in the history of the global oil market, with cumulative supply losses exceeding 360 million barrels in March alone. Roughly 13 million barrels of oil move through the strait on an average day, close to a fifth of the entire world's daily consumption, which is exactly why closing, or even threatening to close it, moves markets as violently as it does. The shipping industry felt that pressure immediately. According to the same tracking data, major marine insurers repriced or withdrew war risk coverage for vessels transiting the Gulf within 48 hours of the February strikes, with premiums jumping from roughly 0.2% of a ship's hull value per transit to around 1%. Container shipping lines began suspending Gulf transits altogether, rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope instead, a detour that Military Spend's tracker estimated added close to 3,800 nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to a single voyage. CNN Business reported in late July that the conflict had by then widened to threaten a second choke point as well, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait at the base of the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthi forces had begun attacking Saudi oil tankers and declared their own blockade, compounding the disruption already radiating out from Hormuz. The scale of the coastal target list becomes clearer when you look at exactly which locations the U.S. military named on the night it reinstated its Hormuz blockade in mid-July. According to a U.S. military statement on social media reported by NBC News, American forces struck military targets across Bushehr, Chah Bahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas. That night, a list that reads like a roll call of Iran's entire Gulf and Gulf of Oman coastline, from the Strait of Hormuz's northern shore down to its southeastern approaches near the Gulf of Oman. NBC's reporting also captured a detail that speaks to just how contested the diplomatic side of this war has become. President Trump briefly floated charging a 20% fee on all cargo shipped through the strait as part of the blockade, a move analysts at ING described as a likely breach of international maritime law before Trump dropped the proposal on social media days later. ING's commodities analysts wrote in a note at the time that the memorandum of understanding Trump and Iranian officials had signed back in June was, in their words, starting to look well and truly dead, a striking assessment given that document had been sold as the war's off-ramp only weeks earlier. None of this coastal defense architecture appeared overnight either, which matters for understanding why it took a sustained campaign, rather than one strike, to degrade it. A Congressional Research Service report on the conflict's impact on Hormuz shipping noted that Iran had spent years fielding a mix of shore-based and ship-based anti-ship missiles, including both anti-ship cruise missiles and anti-ship ballistic missiles, and that the IRGC had announced the deployment of missile systems onto 3 disputed Gulf islands as early as March 2025, nearly a full year before this war began. The same report noted that Iranian forces had formally declared the strait closed as early as March 4, 2026, in the war's opening days, and that the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre had already logged 10 separate attacks on ships transiting the strait, within the first week and a half of fighting, attacks that killed 5 crew members across 2 vessels. That's the infrastructure and the track record. The coastal campaign, F-35 missions included, was built to dismantle piece by piece. Zoom out as the strategic logic connecting all of this becomes easier to follow. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most consequential choke points in global trade, and Iran's coastal surveillance and radar network exists specifically to give Tehran the ability to watch and, if it chooses, threaten traffic moving through it. The United States, for its part, reinstated a naval blockade against Iranian ports as part of this same campaign, and by July 22nd, CENTCOM said that blockade had redirected 9 commercial vessels and disabled 1, on top of the earlier 6 redirected and 1 disabled during the April to June phase. Army Recognition's coverage noted that this blockade effort ran alongside the nightly air campaign specifically to enforce freedom of navigation, while acknowledging that Iranian counterstrikes had, by that point, already killed the 17 American service members mentioned earlier. Reuters and other wire services have separately noted the broader economic ripple effects of this standoff, including spikes in oil and gasoline prices that have been felt well beyond the Gulf region, with some domestic political analysts noting the potential for that economic pressure to become a factor in the upcoming American midterm elections. There's also a diplomatic thread running underneath all of this that's easy to lose amid the strike-by-strike reporting. Delegations from the United States and Iran reportedly entered negotiations in June aimed at ending the war, built around a memorandum of understanding both countries signed. According to reporting from ABC News, the two sides continued exchanging what it described as relatively limited strikes even after that memorandum was signed, with the Strait of Hormuz remaining the primary flashpoint throughout. In other words, even the diplomatic off-ramp that existed didn't stop the coastal campaign. If anything, the fighting around Chah Bahar, Bandar Abbas, and Qeshm Island continued almost without interruption through the supposed cessation period until it broke down entirely and the blockade was reinstated in late July. So where does the F-35 actually fit into all of this, stripped of the dramatic framing? It's one tool among many in a much larger air and maritime campaign aimed at a single strategic target: Iran's ability to see and strike shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Its stealth characteristics made it a natural choice for the riskiest penetration missions into contested Iranian airspace. The missions most likely to bring it into direct contact with the very coastal radar and air defense systems it was being used to destroy. That's precisely why the March incident matters. An aircraft built to be nearly invisible to radar was, according to multiple sourced reports, hit anyway, suggesting Iran's coastal defense network retained at least some functional capability, even after weeks of sustained bombardment. And it's precisely why the disputed July claims matter too, even unconfirmed, because they show both sides now treating the F-35 itself as a symbol worth claiming credit for damaging, whether or not that credit is deserved. None of that amounts to a single cinematic "the F-35 destroyed Iran's coastal hideouts" moment that a title like this one might promise. What the verified record actually shows is a grinding, multi-week campaign of nightly strikes against a distributed network of towers, radar sites, and coastal defenses, punctuated by at least one confirmed incident where an F-35 came under fire and returned home damaged, and by a still unverified Iranian claim of F-35 losses tied directly to one of the most disputed and, on the civilian side, most tragic incidents of the entire campaign: the strike on that residential home in Qeshm's Cha Tangu neighborhood. One more clarification belongs here, because different outlets have used different names for the same opening operation, and precision matters in a story built on sourcing. The Pentagon's own fact sheet labeled the American side of the February 28th campaign Operation Epic Fury. Reporting from the Jerusalem Post, however, indicates that Israel's simultaneous campaign carried its own code name, Operation Roaring Lion, and that the two allied operations were launched together that weekend with the stated aim of creating conditions for regime change in Tehran. That same reporting notes that Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in an Israeli strike on a bunker in Tehran during the opening phase of the war, a detail that helps explain why Iran's coastal retaliation and its insistence on defending the Strait of Hormuz hardened rather than softened as the months wore on. Losing a supreme leader tends to raise the political cost of appearing to back down. It's also worth updating this story right up to where things stood as of this recording, because the situation has kept moving even in the last few days. According to Al Jazeera's live coverage from August 3rd, 2026, CENTCOM says it has now redirected 44 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz since reimposing its blockade in mid-July, and Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, has said a new Hormuz shipping route is being separately negotiated with Oman, involving distinct entry and exit lanes. CNN reported that President Trump said on August 1st that the U.S. had been locked and loaded for what he described as the biggest attack since World War II, aimed at Iranian energy infrastructure, before announcing he was canceling it at the request of Iran and regional allies to allow for renewed negotiations. A defense tracking outlet, Global Security, org, noted that this wasn't the first time Trump had threatened a major escalation only to call it off, citing an imminent deal, pointing to a similar pattern before April's short-lived ceasefire announcement. By the following day, according to CNN, Trump was publicly accusing Iranian leadership of being, in his words, unbelievably duplicitous, after Tehran denied that any new round of talks had actually begun, a whiplash that captures just how unresolved this conflict remains even now, months after the strikes on Chah Bahar and the campaign against Iran's coastal network first began. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly what's solid here and what isn't. The launch of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, the inclusion of F-35 stealth fighters in the declared U.S. force package, the nightly CENTCOM strike statements through July targeting coastal surveillance and air defense sites, the confirmed destruction of the Chah Bahar surveillance tower, the March 19 F-35 emergency landing, and CENTCOM's confirmation of it, the ongoing naval blockade figures, and the 17 American service member deaths reported by CENTCOM through ABC News, all of that traces back to named you. Hess military statements or major wire and broadcast sources, including CENTCOM's own releases, ABC News, CNN, Air and Space Forces magazine, and Army Recognition's campaign tracking. What remains contested or unverified includes the IRGC's claim of 6 F-35's destroyed or damaged at Al Azraq Air Base in Jordan, which CENTCOM has explicitly denied, the authenticity of Iranian video purporting to show an F-35 being struck in March, which Air and Space Forces magazine itself said it could not confirm, and the full circumstances and official U.S. acknowledgement of the Qeshm Island residential strike, where the specific casualty details come from Iranian officials and state-linked media, rather than from an independent or American confirmation. That last gap matters most, and it's the one worth sitting with. A war fought partly through official press releases, and partly through competing claims on social media leaves real events, including, according to Iranian officials, the deaths of a father, a mother, and a 2-year-old child, sitting in a strange space where they are widely reported but not independently verified by the side accused of causing them. That's not a reason to dismiss the reports. It's a reason to hold them with the same care this script has tried to hold every other claim in this story, whether it favors one side's version of events or the other's. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a war is fought this heavily through dueling statements and unverifiable footage, what should the standard be before any of us, creators, journalists, or just people trying to understand the news, treat a claim as fact? Where do you draw that line? Let us know what you think. One last piece of context worth carrying with you. This war has now run for more than 5 months through a formal ceasefire announcement in April that didn't hold, a memorandum of understanding signed in June that analysts now describe as functionally dead, and at least 2 separate moments. Once before that April ceasefire, once again on August 1st, where a major escalation was announced and then called off within days, each time framed as clearing the way for a deal that hasn't yet materialized. Iran's coastal defense network, the F-35 missions flown against it, the surveillance tower at Chah Bahar, and the still unresolved question of what exactly happened at Al Azraq Air Base in Jordan are all pieces of that same unfinished story, not a closed chapter with a tidy ending. Whatever comes out of the talks Trump says are scheduled to resume, the coastline this story has spent the last several minutes walking through, Bandar Abbas, Chah Bahar, Qeshm Island, and the narrow strait running between them, will likely remain the place where the next chapter of this conflict, diplomatic or otherwise, actually gets decided. That's where this one ends for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this as it develops.